I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rick Caudle. I want to introduce Rick. Rick is actually instrumental in helping us put this on. Rick is one of the heads of Savannah Distributing. He's actually one of the gentlemen that gets us our fine Bordeaux, and a lot of his contacts come straight out of the négociants in Bordeaux. So a lot of these wines are direct out of France recently. So they've been stored not very far from the chateaus, and you're probably asking, well, why not at the chateaus? The vast majority of wine is sold to négociants immediately. That vintage, the chateaus rarely hold on to wine. They sell it to négociants, the négociants store the wine, and then they're the ones that we buy the wines from. So a négociant is a person that either buys a lot of wine from the chateaus. That's basically it. He's a wine merchant. He's first tier wine merchant. So Rick, come on up.
Because all the royal heads of all the great chateaux in Bordeaux, they didn't want to mess with the business side of the business. They just wanted their money and be done with it. So I set up what's called the négociant.
I'm going to actually sit and let you take it.
Sit and enjoy. All right, I hate to bore you with a whole lot more history, but I think there's a couple of key elements to understand where we are in the history of Château d'Armagnac. So let's start with just Château d'Armagnac. Simple. Château d'Armagnac. Okay, so you take that A and that I and that L and turn it into a Y, and it becomes pretty easy phonetic. So a lot of people look at that word and go, how do you pronounce this? So Château d'Armagnac, that's simple. D'Armagnac, as some of you or most of you probably know, is part of the Baron Philippe de Rothschild. So a little history on where that all came to be, and I just want to make sure I got all my dates correct here. So in the 16th century, the d'Armagnac brothers, though they had a little slightly different spelling at the end of Armagnac, were boat captains. So Keith was talking about the estuaries and the rivers. They were boat captains and doing quite well. And as all that land had just recently been turned into land, actually from turning it from a swamp into land, which there was still a whole lot of rye growing in that area. The brothers took their money, saw the future in wine, and invested in, actually bought one of the biggest portions of northern Pauillac. So the d'Armagnac brothers owned this. What they didn't realize is all the troubles and aggravations of producing wine. So they held on to this for just about 140, 150 years, and actually wound up selling this portion, which was called Mouton d'Armagnac, in the 1740s. So they sold Mouton d'Armagnac, 1740. It really wasn't known as a great chateau at the time. It was surrounded by Pontet-Canet on one side, and at the time what was called Château Grand Mouton. So in 1843, they really got deeply into debt. They had started building a winery at d'Armagnac. After 20 years of construction, they ran out of money, had to stop, and needed to sell off a portion. And that's when the Rothschild family stepped in. 10 years later, in 1853, that's when Nathaniel Rothschild bought what was then Château Grand Mouton. When he bought Château Grand Mouton, that's when he converted it to Château Mouton Rothschild. So you might notice this common mouton name. So mouton is a sheep, and there were rye pastures and sheep pastures all throughout this part of Pauillac at the time. So Nathaniel Rothschild bought in 1853, and then the next dynamic period was phylloxera. So how many of you are familiar with phylloxera? So phylloxera was the little insect that came from America and went over and wiped out most of the vineyards in Europe. So actually, now when we talk about American wine and European wine, well, all European wines are partially American because they're all grown on American rootstock, because American rootstock was immune to the phylloxera. Phylloxera did not like to eat that. So post-phylloxera, d'Armagnac started planting heavy, very unusual at the time, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. So they weren't that broadly spread then. The primary grape in most of Bordeaux was known as Pic or Côte, or also as we know today, Malbec. So that was really the primary most grown grape. In 1922, that's when Baron Philippe, the young grandson, actually took over at Château Mouton Rothschild. One of the biggest steps at that time was 2 years later, as Keith was talking about négociants and how wine trade was done. All wine was basically sold from the chateau in barrels at the time. And Philippe de Rothschild was really the first to want to control his wine, because when you're shipping it out in a barrel, you don't know what they're doing with it. They can add something else to it, bottle it under your name, do all sorts of things. So he was the first to actually put his wine in a bottle in 24. And then just 10 years later, he bought right next to it Château Mouton d'Armagnac, so what it was called at the time. So there were numerous name changes of the Armagnac over the years. It was known at that time as Château Mouton Baron Philippe after he bought it, so named after himself. That was 56 to 73, 74 to 78. It was renamed Mouton Baron, just keeping it quite simple. And then in 79, it changed to Château Mouton Baron Philippe. So that lasted until 1988. In 89, it was decided to go back to the original name of Château d'Armagnac. So you really are not going to find anything under that label anywhere on the market unless you find something from way back in the 60s under the Armagnac name.
That was actually after the death of the Baron. It was Philippine.
Philippine is the one that chose to
Rothschild.
do that dedication back to her
She
father.
thought the quality of d'Armagnac was so great that it became its own
It
chateau.
needed its original heritage. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Then in 2006, a few years later, they bought some other surrounding smaller properties and incorporated all those into it. So they added those wines into Chateau d'Armagnac and actually some into Chateau Mouton after that stage. So just so you understand on where they are with plantings, and this data is a couple of years old, I'll tell you what's going on today. But Armagnac is planted 53% Cabernet Sauvignon, 36% Merlot, 8% Cab Franc, and 2% Petit Verdot. They are planting more and more Cabernet as new plantings are required, but this is sort of where it was a couple of years ago. The other unique thing about d'Armagnac are the age of the vine. So the average age of the vines at d'Armagnac are 50 years old, though there are certain vines and even small areas with multiple plants that are well over 130 years of age. So really, really going back to the 1890s, some of these vines have been.
They have the oldest planting of Cabernet Franc in the Médoc.
In the Médoc,
It's
yeah.
like 100.
Actually, they're even older than over in Pomerol.
Yeah.
Yeah, so actually some of the oldest completely.